Hi friends, and welcome back to the Meditative Aiden YouTube channel, where we talk about mindfulness and how mindfulness can help you work through the challenges and experiences of everyday life. My name is Aiden, and today we're going to be talking about how mindfulness can help with addiction. In today's video, we're going to cover first kind of the underpinnings of addiction, what it means, and I'm going to illustrate that through a personal example. Then we're going to talk about, some of the science behind addiction and some of the science behind mindfulness and addiction. Then we're going to wrap it up by talking about a practical tool that you can use to work through situations of addiction and cravings and things like that, called urge surfing. Without further ado, let's just get to it. Addiction is defined as a situation in which you become dependent on something to feel good. You feel like you have to have a certain activity, substance, or thing in order to function normally. So what this kind of turns into is kind of an element of your life that without you'll crumble. And to illustrate this, I want to give you a personal example. So in high school, I became crazily addicted to caffeine. And this started when I was young. So there was always caffeine in my parents' house growing up. And it was always in the form of soda. I loved the way that soda tasted as a kid. I loved the flavor and kind of the bubbly sensation. And I loved that energetic feeling that caffeine would give me. As I grew up, I also found that caffeine kind of made me feel relaxed. I talked to my doctor about this some time ago, and he said that that's pretty common for people with ADD to feel relaxed when they take caffeine. Nonetheless, when I was in high school, sometime later, I'd been drinking caffeine since I was a kid onwards, and I was overloaded with a lot of stuff. I was super busy in high school. I was working 16 hours a week every day after classes ended. I was participating in a lot of extracurricular activities that took up a lot of time. I was participating in sports, and on top of that, I had a really heavy course load that was really difficult. I was taking a lot of AP classes, and eventually I got really, stretched thin. I got stressed and tired, and I lost sleep because I had so much to do. I had so many things and so many commitments that, I would stay up late in the night to finish homework assignments or to finish things that I said I would for volunteer things, or I would stay up late because of sports. I found that as I progressed through high school, I would drink caffeine more and more regularly, and I noticed that it was in relation to how much I was doing. I actually ended up at one point drinking a whole 12-pack a day. I would go get one at the beginning of the day and finish it all by the end of the day, just to keep myself awake and energized. And that's why I was drinking it so much, because I felt, tired, I felt stressed, and I had these sensations of depression that would come up. And the caffeine would give me the energy to feel like I was awake and alert enough to do what I needed to do. And it would also help me kind of calm that feeling of depression and push it under. Eventually, it got to that point where I was drinking a pack a day. And there were even some times I remember where I would stay up late in the night and I would drink a whole 12-pack right, before bed in a matter of hours. And I'd be able to fall asleep only an hour or two after my last drink. And the scary thing about that is that I had become so tolerant to it at that point that it didn't have as strong of an effect on me, so I needed more of it to feel alert and energized. It was at a point in my senior year that I realized how much caffeine was coming to control me. There was a night where we ran out of caffeine at my parents' house, and I started to become really desperate for it. It was all that I could think about. I started to feel stressed, I started to feel tired, and again, that feeling of depression started to come back up. And I started freaking out because I needed something to help me cope with those feelings. So I started looking through the house to find anything I could to see if there was some soda stashed somewhere, or see if I had an old stash of soda laying anywhere. And I wasn't able to find anything. I started to get frustrated. I started to get irritated and angsty, and everything was revolving around that caffeine. Eventually, it got to a point where I got in my car, I drove down to the gas station, I picked up a few drinks for myself and finished half of them just on the way home. And it was at that point I started to realize, I wasted so much time just to go get that caffeine. And I can't believe how much I've been thinking about it. It has literally been the center of my attention for the past couple of hours. And this was something that continued into college as well, because when those feelings of stress and tiredness and depression would arise, it was really easy to just go grab some coffee or something and wake myself up and feel okay again. The thing that we can notice here is that I was drinking caffeine to try to get away from difficult experiences, to get away from those experiences of tiredness and depression and stress so that I could feel like I could function normally, to function at the same level as everybody else. And the reason that this started to happen was because my brain started associating these events as they occurred with the need for caffeine. This is based in the parts of your brain that involve dopamine. In particular, what happens with addiction, as far as I understand, is it creates an imbalance in when dopamine is released. The best way that I can explain this is to take a look back at our evolutionary ancestors. And way back then, our evolutionary ancestors, would go out and say they found something that was sugary and something that was fatty, and when they ate it, the brain was like, oh man, that was good, that'll keep us alive. So here's a dump of dopamine, take this dopamine, feel good, as a reminder to keep pursuing that. And the reason that existed was to keep us pursuing things that would keep us alive so that we could propagate as a species and move onward. This was a really good thing way back then because it allowed us to keep seeking those things. Because if you think about it, if we didn't have that dopamine system, there would be no real desire to seek after those things, because carbs and fats would give us all of these nutrients and all of this energy, but where's the motivation in that? Why would we pursue that when we could just sit at home and do nothing? The issue in the modern world, where we're so stressed, we're so overworked, and we're so stretched thin, is that we're constantly seeking after different things that give us that dopamine release so that we can have some relief from the stress that we feel. And to give you an idea, the statistics are kind of alarming. The Addiction Center in the United States states that 21 million people face addiction and have faced addiction in the past year alone. In addition, the European Center for Monitoring Drugs and Substance Abuse has a really long name that's complicated. Nonetheless, the agency in Europe that monitors drug use, 3.7 million people in the United Kingdom have faced substance abuse and addiction in the past year. Furthermore, that same agency states that 1 in 10 people, 10% of the population of Ireland, struggles with addiction and has consumed some kind of addictive substance or illicit substance in the past year alone. And that's everyone ages 15 to 64. These statistics only talk about hard chemicals like meth and Adderall, weed, and things like that. It doesn't include things like shopping, TV, video games, your cell phone, the internet, and everything. And you can imagine if we included those statistics that they would only be more terrifying and more alarming. And it's really unfortunate to state that you probably know someone personally that's suffering from addiction, if not yourself. Nonetheless, all of the study that I've done and everything we've talked about so far indicates two things about addiction, two primary factors. The first one is a need to avoid or get away from uncomfortable or difficult experiences. The second is that addiction involves an imbalance in the amounts of dopamine in your brain and when they're released. And when it comes to addiction, there are a lot of different varieties of, therapies that are used to treat it, which usually involve talk therapy and medication. And I wanted to figure out what it would be like if mindfulness practices were implemented in these therapeutic practices and if it would actually help with addiction. So the studies that I read showed that people who were involved in some kind of recovery program or were being treated with methadone for narcotic addiction, when they were supplemented with a mindfulness training course, they actually had greater improvement rates in, how they were coping with their addiction and how frequently they were relapsing compared to people who weren't taking mindfulness-based courses. Additionally, there's a study that's been done on nicotine recovery and mindfulness. And typically the way that nicotine recovery works is people use patches. You're prescribed nicotine patches. And over time, you're given a certain dose of nicotine in this patch and it's slowly titrated down. It's slowly, pushed down to a small amount. And the idea is over time to wean people off of nicotine very slowly. And in this study, mindfulness practices and training actually outperformed nicotine patches in treatment therapy and relapse prevention and everything. And this is pretty important because nicotine addiction is really hard to beat, because nicotine, as you probably know, is a really addictive chemical. So to say that mindfulness actually outperforms some of the current therapeutic methods for nicotine addiction recovery, that's a big thing. So in relation to that first item, trying to get away from experiences which causes addiction, there's a program called Mindfulness-Based Relapse Prevention that was developed specifically to treat people with addiction using mindfulness-based practices. The creators of mindfulness-based relapse prevention state that change occurs in addiction using mindfulness by changing the way that you judge events, the way that you perceive them, and the way that you interact with them. To illustrate this, I'll go back to my personal example with caffeine. Now, when the feeling of tiredness would come up, immediately I would judge that as a bad feeling to have, because I had so many things that I needed to do that I couldn't afford to be tired. I needed to be alert to perform all the things I needed to. So immediately I would judge that and then try to get away and avoid that experience so that I could just, not have to deal with it. And what mindfulness-based relapse prevention teaches is that when that sensation comes up of tiredness, whatever that trigger is, instead of trying to get away from it and run, you actually lean into the experience. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive at first. The creators of the program suggest that mindfulness works because it immediately targets that judgment that you're making about that experience as it comes up. And instead of acting on it or getting away from it, you allow yourself to experience it and observe it. This is something we've talked about a lot in the past, so I won't beat a dead horse on that in particular. Nonetheless, the important takeaway here is that, first, mindfulness-based relapse prevention has shown great results in helping people recover from addiction with great relapse prevention. And this suggests that mindfulness can, first and foremost, help with that situation where we're trying to get away from experiences. It treats that first condition that we've been talking about. Now, the other component of addiction that we haven't really addressed too much so far is that imbalance in the dopamine system. And what happens with that is, of course, we've gotten our dopamine system hijacked. We constantly need something to feel good as we get away from these experiences. A lot of studies have been conducted to try to determine how mindfulness affects the brain and brain chemicals and things like that when practiced in trying to recover from addiction. And a lot of the prominent studies actually show that mindfulness changes the way that your brain works, in particular the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of your brain right here in the front, gives you your big forehead. Now, you don't have to remember what the prefrontal cortex is. What's important to know is the prefrontal cortex is involved in decision making. In particular, there are several different parts of the prefrontal cortex, and one part is involved in, impulsive behavior and addiction-seeking tendencies. And the other part of your prefrontal cortex is involved in stronger decision-making, thinking about the future and things like that. Is that when mindfulness practices have been utilized for some time, it actually changes the activity in your brain. So when you're facing addiction, that part of your brain, that part of your prefrontal cortex that's less involved in decision-making and is more impulsive, that part is more active. And what happens is mindfulness practices change the activity of your brain over to the other side that's involved with control over those situations. There have also been a lot of other studies that have been conducted that show, stress tolerance and, different abilities to work through, and lots of physiological data showing that, when triggers occur, your heart rate can be lower, your respiratory rate is lower, your stress hormones are lower, so on and so forth. The point here is that mindfulness has been shown to change that activity in your brain that is involved with that hijacked dopamine system. All of this is evidence that mindfulness works to help with addiction. Now, at this point, I really want to give you guys a practical tool to help you work through the experiences of addiction as they arise, in particular cravings and, an urge to get, that thing that makes you feel good. And this is called urge surfing. So I want you to imagine that when experiences arise like craving or that desire to go seek that thing that makes you feel good, that craving is like a wave. And it starts slowly, it has a buildup where you start to feel that sensation arise. And over time, it eventually reaches a crescendo. Anyways, the wave reaches a crest, and that's when that desire, that need to feed the addiction comes to its most severe. But eventually, just like waves, they eventually calm and they subside. Urge surfing teaches us how to ride these waves of craving like a surfer. So if you ever wanted to be a surfer, I guess now is a great time to pretend to be a surfer. So to use urge surfing, when these experiences arise, your first task is to just observe it. And the goal here is to prevent you from following that craving and following to feed that addiction. You're just observing that craving as it arises, and you're observing the different feelings that arise, the different sensations, and everything involved with it. And you watch as it reaches that crest and that severity, and then over time you allow it to just kind of subside, and you allow yourself to feel it subside. The idea with urge surfing is to teach you how to respond to these different cravings without judging them, allowing, for me, that sensation of tiredness to come up and not immediately judging it as a bad thing. So that when that sensation comes up, instead of trying to get away from it, I'm allowing myself to non-judgmentally be aware of it. So with each breath that you take, you just kind of ride that wave. You just ride the wave of craving as it comes and it goes. And the thing is that it's not going to just stop at some point. These cravings might be small. They might be little like lap pool waves. These cravings might also be huge, like tidal waves. And the point is that when those cravings arise, to just allow yourself to be with it without trying to fight the experience and get away from it. And this can be really uncomfortable. In fact, it is really uncomfortable. Because when that happens, you naturally want to get away from it. And what urge surfing teaches us is that instead of doing that, instead of trying to run away, we sit with the experience, don't judge it, we compassionately look at it, all the mindfulness things. And the thing is, like I said before, over time, this practice actually helps you change that imbalance in your brain and overcome that hijacked system. It's really difficult to give a good idea, a good explanation of what urge surfing is. So this is something that I really encourage you to go check out the blog article on. I've got a full excerpt from a clinician's guide that describes how to go through the process and how to be aware of everything as it occurs. And this is something that also complements regular meditation practice. You know, whether that's walking meditation or sitting meditation or otherwise, the point is that it's kind of a cultivation of mindfulness of those cravings when they arise and understanding how to cope with them in healthier ways. I've noticed that as I've gone through and used urge surfing more often, it's really helped me become more aware of when these cravings arise and how I'm responding to them, and more importantly, why I'm responding to them the way that I am. You know, it can be really difficult when cravings arise to just sit down and do nothing and just observe the craving arising, because cravings come kind of like, for me, it's like a tidal wave. It's like a brick wall saying, we need to go this way. We have to go get that thing. We have to go feel good or else. And over time, as you cultivate mindfulness, you can step away from that feeling and just see it as a feeling, as something that's distant from you, an experience that's happening maybe in your body, but it's not happening to you. That sounds a little abstract and weird maybe, but the point is that you distance yourself from the situation and allow yourself more freedom to just be free from that. The thing with urge surfing is that you can use it on the go whenever you're walking around and you suddenly feel a craving. And I've done that plenty of times where, you know, this craving has come up and I'll sit down for a minute and just allow myself to experience it and just be with that experience. There's also a method of practicing urge surfing where you sit down and you go through an experience. You imagine a situation where a craving might occur. And this is what's described in the blog article a little more clearly. And it's kind of like exercising and preparing yourself for some kind of fitness challenge. You know, it's exercising those mindfulness muscles so that when those cravings arise, you have the tools and have practiced using those tools enough that you can work with that experience without trying to run away from it and going towards that addiction. The thing is that when you practice it in that way, where you're sitting down and intentionally thinking about an addiction and working through how you're going to react to it, it's really important that you sit down in a comfortable and safe space where you know that you won't be threatened by relapse. Because the thing is that when you bring up these sensations and try to work through them intentionally, the danger arises that you might actually trigger something that causes a craving that you just can't beat. And if that happens, it's recommended that you let go of that experience, you let go of the situation you're thinking of, and focus on a different situation instead. So mindfulness can help with addiction. The thing is, it's been shown and it's been proven, and it's proving enormously effective for treating addiction. And the amazing thing is that you can use it in the comfort of your own home. That's not to say you shouldn't go and seek professional help. By all means, go and do that. But the evidence is there that mindfulness has and will help you with addictive cravings, including how you interact with cravings as they arise and how your brain evolves around that sense, that dopamine system. I have to say that overcoming caffeine addiction has been really difficult for me because it's something I consumed in such large quantities for such a long time. And the thing is that it's something that I still struggle with to this day. You know, if I'm walking through the grocery store and I see caffeine, I want it, and that urge comes back. And it's really hard in that instance to practice being mindful and to practice that sense of urge surfing, to just be with that craving and to let go of it. As I've gone through these different, experiences, I've learned how to experience that craving and just let go of the need to act on it. And I've also noticed that over time I've developed healthier habits to help me feel good when, those events, those stressors come up. Instead of going straight for the caffeine, I recognize now that when the experience of exhaustion comes up, it's okay to feel that way, and I actually can still perform just as well when tired. I know that you can learn a lot from mindfulness, and I know that mindfulness can have a huge impact on you if you're struggling with addiction. And I really want you to know that if you are facing addiction, I'm so sorry. Addiction sucks. Just know that you're not alone, and know that you can change. There is hope for you, and the future is bright. If you fear that you're facing addiction, or you know that you're facing addiction, I really encourage you to develop mindfulness practices to help you work through the experience, and I encourage you to seek professional help to help you work through that experience as well. If you are in urgent need of help because of the addiction that you're facing, if it's coming to a point where it's a crisis, I really encourage you to go to the National Helpline and call the number. It's a service that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, around the clock, to help you find the resources and tools that you need to ensure that you're safe and that you can work through it. The National Helpline will refer you to local resources and local professionals that can help you work through it, and will also provide you with immediate tools that you can use to help you work through the experience in that moment. Guys, I really hope that today's video was informative and helpful for you. Mindfulness can help with addiction. Mindfulness is a powerful tool. It changes the way that we relate to our experiences. It changes the way that our hijacked dopamine system responds and the activity in our brain. And it's made an enormous difference in my life and the different addictions that I've faced. If you liked today's video, I encourage you to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. If you want to learn more, which I encourage you to, go to the meditativeaiden.com website and check out the blog post, Can Mindfulness Help with Addiction? There's a lot more information on there that I think you guys will find really useful and valuable. You can also listen to the podcast this week on your favorite podcasting platform. And don't forget, you can follow Meditative Aiden on Instagram and Facebook for daily advice and guidance to just kind of help motivate you and help you work through your day-to-day challenges. Really appreciate you guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.